One of the most exhilarating elements in video games is always the boss battles. Whether they're encountered at the end of a major story beat or purposely sought out by those looking for a formidable challenge, boss battles serve to test a player's understanding of specific gameplay systems and how far they can be pushed. But while most boss fights end up being brute force affairs where, assuming players aren't grossly overleveled, they will need to use their toolkits in optimum fashion to make it through, there are other bosses where the challenge can seem insurmountable at first, until you find out they have a crippling weakness. Unlike common vulnerabilities to certain elements or highlighted in-game strategies, these particular weaknesses are a bit more debilitating. Think of them as an Achilles heel, whereby players are able to achieve a quick and almost unfair victory. We've covered a few of these before in the past, but for this video, we wanted to turn this over to you, the viewers. So with the caveat that we won't be including more than one boss per game, here are 7 brutal bosses that had unexpected but exploitable weaknesses, according to you, the viewers. And we're going to kick things off with Defender X from Final Fantasy X. Final Fantasy X features some intense and thrilling boss battles, with entries like Seymour Flux and Yunalesca being notorious in this regard. But amongst the game's compendium of lesser bosses, one often stands out due to how punishing it seemed, at least on the surface. Defender X was a mech-like entity that the party faced on the bridged area between the Calmlands and Mount Gagazet. It possessed incredible defense and could dole out some serious damage with its normal attacks. This was then compounded by Mighty Guard, Blast Punch and Haymaker, very potent abilities that further enhanced its defensive capabilities while dealing incredible damage. These elements conspired to make Defender X a troublesome foe, especially for inexperienced or underprepared players. But there was a specific and somewhat unexpected weakness that could be exploited: Provoke. By using Tidus's Provoke ability, Defender X would be forced to target only Tidus, and instead of cycling through the array of potential abilities, it would have the knock-on effect of forcing Defender X to only use Blast Punch. Left unchecked, this ability could really hurt the party due to its gravity-based nature, as it was the perfect dovetail with Haymaker. But by forcing it to remain isolated to just one character, its harmful effects were nullified, not least because gravity-based spells and abilities are incapable of KOing a target. With this strategy in place, the party then just needed to use Armor Break and then watch Defender X crumble. Final Fantasy VII Remake introduced a wealth of intriguing details, with the city of Midgar featuring plenty of embellishments. This sentiment was applied to almost every aspect of the game, and one of the most commendable areas was with the combat. It saw almost every encounter elevated to new heights, and one of the areas where this was perhaps felt more than others was with the one-on-one duel against Rufus Shinra. This fight is notorious for its troublesome nature, not least because of the complications added by Darkstar, and this notion is only further enhanced when playing on hard mode. But even though Rufus may seem impossible to overcome at times because of his frustrating speed and counters and the combinations created via his link-up with Darkstar, Rufus had a surprising weakness: status effects. Even though status effects are in almost every Final Fantasy game, they are seldom useful, as bosses are often granted immunity to almost all of the useful ones. But here, Rufus was not made immune to effects such as sleep or stop, and with this weakness exploited, this devilish encounter gets turned into a rather trivial one. With Rufus stationary, Cloud is able to land his Braver ability for an instant stagger, and with time afforded for Cloud to build up a full ATB gauge, the damage dealing potential during this window is quite extreme. This strategy is then a rinse and repeat until Rufus is dispatched, with Cloud barely even breaking a sweat. Now, as the Final Fantasy franchise developed, we've seen numerous games remade or remastered. To try and coax older players back, developers often expanded on the content featured in the original games, and quite often, this saw the introduction of super bosses. When Final Fantasy IV was re-released as Final Fantasy IV Advance, that was the exact strategy chosen, and one of the super bosses added, known as Brachiorydos, could be found at the bottom of the Lunar Ruins. Brachiorydos is considered one of, if not the hardest boss in the game. One of the elements that made this fight so challenging was Brachiorydos' ability to switch between numerous phases. Each came packed with a slew of offensive spells, able to deal high damage and disrupt the rhythm of the party. However, in spite of Brachiorydos' packed arsenal and supposed invincibility, there was a weakness. Now, we normally wouldn't count ultimate weapons as a weakness due to their relative power and ability to level the playing field. But when talking about a super boss, they're kind of fair game, and in this case, that's even more so applicable, as Kane's ultimate weapon, Abel's Lance, had the ability to randomly cast the very powerful resistance-ignoring Tornado. What made this so potent was that should Tornado be cast and not reflected, it had the ability to instant kill Brachiorydos. So to win, all players would have to do was play with a defensive mindset and bide their time. Final Fantasy X-2 featured one of the most dynamic interpretations of the fabled ATB system, and to make full use of this, the developers introduced numerous challenging bosses. Some of the most difficult could be found within the game's optional dungeon, dubbed Via Infinito, and perhaps the most notorious of these would be the pseudo-superboss called Chak. In Final Fantasy X, Yunalesca had represented a firm challenge, and Chak, which was created from her unsent form, continued that trend by packing a serious punch. Abilities such as Heaven's Cataract and Stony Glare were perilous, not least because Stony Glare could bypass any immunities to petrified targets and leave them vulnerable. This made Chak a real threat, but defeating this dangerous enemy could be made much easier if players utilised the Lady Luck dress sphere. One of the unique aspects of Lady Luck was its critical auto ability. This ensured that all physical attacks landed as critical hits, something that often caused enemies to stagger in response. This then came into play as Chak was given a rather long stagger animation. This long animation meant that if players repeatedly attacked Chak in a specific rhythm using the Lady Luck dress sphere auto ability, it would become stun-locked and prevented from taking a single turn, which then meant Chak could be defeated with relative ease. When discussing exploitable weaknesses, the conversation can't go too far without mentioning the famous instances where curative and restorative spells and items can be used to great effect against undead enemies. It's perhaps one of the most well-known and popular strategies across the franchise, with one of the most effective instances being the use of a Phoenix Down against Ginatak in the original Final Fantasy VII. But whereas many previous instances of this were with mandatory bosses encountered during a regular playthrough, there's also a final boss that has the same weakness, the Dark King from Final Fantasy Mystic Quest. And to make it worse, the quality of the spell didn't even really have to be that high due to the nature of the weakness. By using Benjamin to cast a simple curative spell, players could defeat the Dark King with little to no effort. But unlike the other, perhaps more well-known instances of curatives being used to defeat powerful foes, this didn't happen because the Dark King was undead. Rather, this outcome stemmed from an overflow glitch, wherein the cure spell cast against the Dark King inadvertently broke the damage limit. This would then result in over 10,000 points of damage being dealt within a single turn. So while it's rather commonplace to see a curative spell cause mass damage or one-shot enemies sporadically, that weakness has seldom applied to what is thematically the most important battle in the game. For this next entry, we're choosing to be a bit more unorthodox, as it sees us venture a bit deeper into the Final Fantasy family tree than normal, and that's because the boss featured is from Bravely Second. As a spiritual successor to Final Fantasy The Four Heroes of Light, Bravely Default built upon some of the core mechanics, and it meant that one of the central systems related to asterisks, a Bravely equivalent to crowns or jobs. Taking advantage of the asterisks was fundamental to success, and similar to our inclusion of Chak from Final Fantasy X-2, there was one particular boss in Bravely Second that featured a specific asterisk-related weakness, and that boss was Revenant Grace. Revenant Grace served as the holder of the Guardian asterisk and could be encountered at the Skyhold. What made this particular encounter quite difficult was that Revenant was able to put solid pressure on players, able to easily KO low defense party members. But the real trouble started once Revenant's health reached about 1/3 of its total value, as it was at this point that he would be able to possess party members and use them against the player. However, this tactic will come with a serious drawback. By this point in the game, players would have already acquired the Exorcist asterisk, and the unique property of this asterisk were its undo abilities, which were capable of restoring target entities to a previous state. It meant that moves like Undo HP and Undo MP would revert the target back to whatever HP and MP they had at the beginning of the previous turn. Thus, the Exorcist asterisk would prove to be the key factor in securing a much easier victory against Revenant, as players could wait for him to stop possessing a party member and then use Undo HP to instantly kill him by reducing his HP to 0. That then brings us onto our final entry, which relates to another superboss, and this one has become a lot more notorious than Brachiorydos. Even though earlier Final Fantasy games did feature tough, optional encounters, it wasn't until Final Fantasy V that super bosses became codified. This happened via the arrival of Omega and Shinryu, and both were a real step up in challenge compared to every previous boss to have featured in a Final Fantasy game. But they weren't without their weaknesses. Shinryu, for example, could have some of its power stripped away by each member of the party equipping coral rings. Omega posed an altogether different challenge to Shinryu. It had incredible defensive attributes and some devastating offensive abilities, such as Wave Cannon and Delta Attack. Now, as with many other mechanical entities, Omega did have a weakness to lightning, but it wasn't so much of an Achilles heel due to Omega's defensive wall, which even included Permanent Shell. Instead, what we're going to focus on is an ability associated with the Bard job known as Romeo's Ballad or Love Song. This ability was available in History, and when executed via the Bard's Sing command, it had the ability to inflict the stop status on all enemies. And this was the intriguing point, as Omega had no defense against this particular status effect. Thus, if players were able to make use of haste and spam Romeo's Ballad against Omega, they could effectively prevent it from ever having a turn. This would then allow players to hack away at its HP with Thunder Affinity skills or other high damage abilities and secure a rather easy victory. With that, however, we'd like to thank all of the commenters on the previous video for suggesting these wonderful additions. But are there any more brutal bosses that contain specific weaknesses? If so, please share with us in the comments. And if you enjoyed this video, feel free to like it and subscribe to the channel for more content. Alright everyone, with that, this is Daryl signing out. As always, I'd like to give a big thank you to all of our Patreon and YouTube membership supporters, especially Benjamin Snow, The Livestream, Gregory, Justin Dent and Sukun TDK, who are super special Onion Knight supporters, and of course, a big thank you to everyone for watching this video. I'll see you all again soon for more Final Fantasy goodness.